Today I'm really honored and pleased to moderate a session, very important session with Mr. Halsey Minor, a true legend in Silicon Valley who had funded and nurtured so many innovative and disruptive companies in the Silicon Valley. The cumulative value of the companies that he has helped create, directly or indirectly, have been over $130 billion. He pioneered the first concept and entities in internet publishing company with CNET, and then he also helped create the world's largest CRM company now, which is Salesforce, as everyone knows, and many other companies. More recently, he has also focused on some media companies as well as fintech companies utilizing blockchain. And today, I believe he has a lot of insight to share with the subject of the year of enterprise blockchains. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Halsey Minor and ask him to come up to the podium and give his presentation. So after the presentation, we'll come back to the chair and have about a 30 to 40 minute dialogue. So thank you very much. Would you please welcome Mr. Minor?
Thank you. So it's now closing in on 10 years from the birth of Bitcoin and, of course, the blockchain that enabled it. And the question is the blockchain actually a transformative technology? At present, it's a $220 billion question, because that's the aggregate value of all of the various different cryptocurrencies. If you think about it, 220 billion is only about 25% of the value of Amazon. So this is actually a very important question. A lot of people compare the blockchain to the internet, and I think that's actually a very good way of thinking about it. So I participated in the birth of the internet. What was so amazing was that for the first time, humankind could share information, anyone to anyone, with a simple browser. You could connect to a simple server, and we as human beings were able to share information almost without cost across global borders. And that ability for human beings to share information was, as we all now know, probably one of the more transformative events in human society. The blockchain also allows for the sharing of information. It's a little more difficult, but it basically does the same thing. The blockchain also has a superpower that the internet doesn't have, and that's the ability to also share value. So the blockchain allows for sharing information and sharing value. The problem with that is the sharing of value is probably the most regulated human activity in the history of mankind. So in order to get the full value out of the blockchain, somehow you have to unleash the ability to move that money around fluidly. I'm not making an argument against regulation. Regulations are good. I'm just simply pointing out that for the blockchain to realize its full potential, it has to deal with the friction that comes from all of the laws that govern the movement of funds. Let me see if I can. So just to kind of give you a snapshot of where we are today, the theoretical and the traditional. The theoreticals, I'm referring to ICOs. These are companies who believe that they can replace existing companies in the existing economy. And so for every company or every industry, there's a blockchain ICO that says we can do it better. On the other side, on the traditional side, I'm really talking about small, medium, and large businesses, the enterprise, and they have a very, very different point of view on the blockchain. They are trying to figure out how to use the blockchain to make their existing business better. On the one hand, you've got total replacement, and on the other hand, you've got how do we make what we do more valuable by making it less friction and better processes. So my own career kind of echoes this, and I would say probably the way the internet grew probably echoes this. When I started CNET, their goal was to put out of business magazine publishing companies in the computer industry that cumulatively had about $2.5 billion in revenue. And when I left CNET in 2000, the beginning of 2000, we were a NASDAQ 100 company, and we had bankrupted one of the largest companies that published computer magazines, and the others were a fraction of the size they were when we began. So it was a zero-sum game. It was us or them. Now I left to help start Salesforce, and there our vision was completely different. There our vision was to take existing companies and by giving them cloud-based software, allow them to do the things that they did better. So we tried to take the entire ecosystem of global business and we tried to make it function better. So if you look at the opportunity for the blockchain, which I would say is really measured as a portion of the cloud. Today, that cloud revenue is divided between these centralized services like Amazon and Salesforce, and these coming new decentralized services. But today, I would bet 99.9% of all of this money is from centralized services. So just to give you just a brief insight into one of the things that we are doing now, Amazon has a business called Amazon Web Services. All of you know about it. You all know that it's very profitable. They have a service that just about every major media company uses, where they build centralized data centers, and the media companies give them their video, and it gets processed, stored, and streamed. And that's a big deal because 20% of the internet is video, and it's growing at 25% per year. What we have created at VideoCoin is actually a decentralized version of this same capability. So this is a very complicated diagram on how we do it, but I can simplify it for you very easily. What we do is we take advantage of computing resources all across the internet that aren't being used, and we harness them as servers to do the same thing that Amazon does in its data centers that are centralized. So we use underutilized resources across the internet to do the same thing that Amazon does in their single data centers. And what this allows us to do by using these underutilized resources is to apply the same business model that's driven Airbnb and Uber and apply that to computing. This is important because, for reasons that I'm not totally clear on, there's been massive overbuilding in data centers, and fully 30% of servers that sit in data centers are what are called zombies. They're not used at all. They're straight out overbuilding within the data centers, and they represent about $30 billion of capital that's been deployed that has no revenue. It just sits there. The benefit of bringing all this together and using all of these servers that are unused in the same model of Airbnb and Uber is that we can dramatically lower the cost by using these underutilized resources by between 50 and 80% over what Amazon charges the same media companies. Point 3, which is disintermediate the market oligarchs, the big issue that all these media companies have around the world is they are paying Amazon to stream their video, and Amazon is their #1 competitor. And so that creates a very difficult situation for media companies who rely on Amazon for their video, but at the same time, the profit is being reinvested in Amazon becoming a large media company, which they are on track to do. We've started exploring 5G because we think there's actually a very interesting and similar kind of model that can be applied to this important new area of technology. So the existing way 4G works is there are a smaller number of towers, and the activities that go on are primarily using centralized services. We all know these as cloud services that we use today. 5G, on the other hand, is, for many reasons, important reasons, a decentralized service. It is between 10 to 20 times the speed. It has 1/10 or more or slightly less the latency. This is because the transactions are all happening at the edge. So for instance, if you want to have a bunch of cars talking to each other on the freeway, you cannot have a centralized service. You need communication that's going on at the edge. It provides higher capacity, way more data, and the biggest part of 5G, and I think people are most excited, is it's not just faster, data. It's actually an enabler by building edge-based services to create entirely new kinds of applications, smart cities, car example that I gave you, et cetera. The big problem is how do you actually put 10 times as many of these receivers into cities around the world. It's very difficult just to get the 4K receivers that they have today. How do you get 10 times as many of them deployed? And one study in the United States said the cost of putting these new 5G infrastructure in place is $300 billion. So just the cost of doing it is astronomical. And then, of course, all of these things need to happen in order for the world to have fully deployed and commercially operating coverage for 5G services. So what we've been studying, and seems possible, is that you allow individuals and businesses to be able to purchase small cell radios, and for them to be able to operate those and to be paid in tokenized value. And the reason you want tokenized value is because instead of paying in currencies all around the world, it's very complicated if I had to pay in yen and won and pounds and dollars. So you can pay in this universal currency, and you start from the bottom up. So people can go and they can buy the radio and they can make money off of it, and in so doing, you create an entirely new class of entrepreneurs. You create an economic and organic reason for these small cells to be deployed. And of course, this accelerates the network's development. And because all of these things happen, and because the world wants 5G, and it has so much great potential, the world wins by this happening faster. Now, this isn't really a crazy idea, because in the United States, a lot of the towers aren't owned by the telecom companies. You can see here, Crown Castle alone has 40,000 towers that they as a company operate for and on behalf of the telecom companies. So what we're talking about is taking this model and making it much larger and much wider, but people aren't going to be deploying these huge towers. They're going to deploy small cells. So the point that I'm trying to hopefully given you some insight into is that it was very easy to get immediate value out of the internet. Anytime you had a browser and you went to a website and you got information, it was an aha moment, and immediately you knew that the internet was going to be valuable. The reason why it's so hard to tell today is because that second component around money has a lot of friction in the world today. And what I hope I could present in these two use cases are, these are hugely important enablers for the next generation of the internet, which can in fact be solved by the blockchain. But they are serious, they are things that require serious and significant development. And so, while I believe that we are moving towards an enterprise blockchain, these things are not going to happen overnight. But I do believe, to my original question, is the blockchain transformative? I believe it's absolutely transformative. Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Minor, thank you so much for the very insightful presentation. I'm sure that the audience got a lot of that from that. Now let's have a conversation about blockchain. And the topic, of course, for the audience today is 2019, the year of enterprise blockchain. We already touched upon the subject a little bit. So let's talk about these subjects that you already covered, as well as perhaps a few others in a little more detail. So the first topic that I would like you to talk about is really from the beginning, why you entered the world of the blockchain. I mean, you've been, of course, known as a father of many innovative efforts, some of which have become amazing influencers and innovators. And now, with blockchain, you seem to have kind of focused on this particular technology. Is there a reason why you kind of did that?
Yeah, so this is kind of the second step in my effort around the blockchain. I created a company in 2013 called Uphold. It's one of the few companies that allows you to connect your US, your UK, or your European bank account and buy crypto. It competes with a company many of you probably know called Coinbase. They're the leader. We started about a year and a half after them. So that was the first problem, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's very difficult to get banks to allow you to use their infrastructure to buy cryptocurrency. And this is the superpower, I tell you, that exists. That regulation stands in the way of being fully realized. The vision that I had for the industry, and I think it's become more and more true every day, is that I believe that money is going to change from being bounded by national borders and instead being bounded by industries. And sometimes when I talk about this, I'll put a slide up, and on one side of the road, is Canada, on the other side of the road is the United States. It's a residential neighborhood. And if you're born on one side, use the Canadian dollar, and if you're born on the other side, use the US dollar. And you can see that these things are kind of arbitrary. You know, money is just very, very arbitrary. And so my belief is that if you start getting to programmable money that's intelligent, then what are its best uses? Well, borders probably aren't it. But if you can create money that actually does what Salesforce does, which is or create business processes, then you've taken money and you have given it this superpower that allows for businesses to improve their business processes around money. And the two examples that I gave here, I didn't have those ideas early on, but I think they're the kind of things that show that information and money, when they move together, can have extraordinary effects within industries.
Sorry. Well, thank you so much, and that's very interesting. We are now talking about blockchain, but I don't think we can really talk about blockchain without also at least touching upon the cryptocurrencies, can we? So As everybody knows, the cryptocurrency market valuation went over $800 billion at the start of this year, but it then started this steep decline to now a little over $200 billion, and it doesn't show signs of any reprieve. So what are some of your thoughts about the state of the market and the immediate future, I mean, say next year or two?
So when I started Uphold, Bitcoin was at $5. And my business plan that I showed, because Uphold lets you buy cryptocurrency, but it also let you move back and forth into other fiat currencies. So you could instantaneously turn your Bitcoin into dollars or euros or yuan or yen. And the reason that was part of what the service did was because in my business plan I showed a period of 6 months where the price of Bitcoin went from $270 down to $70. I think this was around 2012. So the industry has been volatile from the beginning. And you know, I think that is the nature of currencies today that aren't backed fundamentally by anything. I think that changes. My personal belief is that if you look at it, the crash that happened wasn't really a crash at all. Bitcoin and all these cryptocurrencies got way ahead of themselves relative to their utility. So to me, it's more coming back to the norm than it is anything. For a lot of younger people in particular, it's been very traumatic to watch it happen, but the reality is this is just the way things grow in value over time. So I think as we start to see these new currencies emerge that actually do something, that actually serve a market, I think you're going to see an explosion in value in these kinds of things. But these are, you know, going back to my point, these are complex things to build, and once you've built them, they are incredibly transformative. And the gas, which is the money that drives those, you know, almost by definition has to become more valuable to service an increasingly larger industry.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we can talk a little bit more about the shift from the startups to the enterprises, and maybe some of the seed reasons for why that's happening may be related to the fact that, as you just pointed out, that it's so difficult to design the mechanisms. Is a very complicated topic, right? But as everybody knows, when it started, it was a world of startups with ICOs, and sometimes companies could, you know, attract a lot of money through ICOs with just a bunch of papers and a fancy concept, nothing more. But now things have changed, or things seem to have changed. We hear a lot about large companies investing very heavily into modifying or at least experimenting with their modification of the processes, for example, and tinkering with new business services and models. But what do you think lies at the bottom, the real reasons why enterprises are thinking about that and experimenting?
It's simple. Big companies have a hard time changing anything they do. And the more complicated the technology, particularly when it involves money, it becomes even that much more difficult. But, you know, the experience at Salesforce, which is, you know, somewhat enlightening, no venture capitalist would invest in Salesforce, which is now a $110 billion company, because nobody believed that companies would take their sales information and put it in the cloud. And there were no venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who would believe that that would ever happen. And so you have, you know, getting companies to change the way they think about things is a really long and difficult process. And so I think, you know, you have all of this sort of innovation going on in the ICOs, and what has to happen is that innovation, like we did at Salesforce, needs to be brought over and applied to these traditional companies. And you need, for the first time, you need people who aren't just trying to start a brand new way of doing, you know, everything, but who bring thoughtful and innovative ways of improving the ways existing, the $90 trillion economy, how these businesses operate. And when I say 2019 is the year of the blockchain, I think we're moving away from ICOs as innovation, and we're going to start seeing innovation that directly addresses these corporate problems, just as I transitioned from CNET over to Salesforce to do exactly the same thing.
That's great. Any particular industries or any particular business processes that you think are the most ripe for innovation?
Yeah, I think one we're beginning to see now are an appreciation of the role of fiat currencies in blockchain usage. And technologies like Ethereum, while interesting in their programmable money, businesses can't use Ethereum because they don't pay their employees in Ethereum, and they don't buy their goods in Ethereum, and they don't pay their rent in Ethereum. And so as we start to see blockchains built around fiat, and going back to my Uphold experience, it's very hard to integrate the banking system into this. But if you can start automating business processes around the movement of money, it's a massive opportunity, because in things like supply chain, people have been able to order dynamically and automatically, using ERP systems. They've been able to track their goods in flight. But if you look at how they pay their vendors, it looks like, it did 50 or 60 years ago. There's been you should be able to take a QR code off a pallet, and you should be able to automatically send money to the people who sent you the goods. So automating processes for banks and for businesses around money is I think the lowest hanging fruit and the most important thing.
So no more days of waiting 90 days to get your payment then?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. That's very inspiring, but there are still remaining kind of hindering and lingering questions. For example, what about regulation, and what about the ecosystems? Money, as he said, is one of the most regulated aspects of human life and societies. So how do you actually ease the introduction of that component, that modification of the money transfers into this? That's a whole regulatory thing. The other thing is that if you look at many industries, eventually you will have to come up with a kind of a widespread ecosystem. Now, if you look at blockchain, although it's barely 10 years old, you already see so much fragmentation, so much divergence, and everybody wants to become that ecosystem. So do you think there needs to be some changes in terms of regulation as well as some ecosystem building efforts?
Yes, I've been focused on, been around, at Uphold, we ended up having to buy part of a US bank. So I understand the regulatory part very well. And a lot of these regulations are really around trying to protect consumers. I mean, they actually serve important roles. The problem is that you have is a lot of these problems aren't just national; they're also international. So you have rules that govern. You have rules that govern what happens inside each country, which are different, and we have international rules, which are effectively different depending upon what you're doing. I think somewhere along the line, companies are going to need to strike a balance between allowing innovation to happen and also protecting consumers. And I think that if that balance is not struck, but I believe that balance will be struck, the question is how long it will take. And I think there's a certain degree of enlightenment that the regulators have to have, at the very least creating sandboxes. A lot of people think that the United States is very anti-crypto because they've gone after some ICOs criminally. And my response to that is that the ones they went after were actually criminal enterprises, and they should have gone after them. But I don't think the United States, just speaking for where I live, I think they're actually fairly open-minded, and I think they've done some things like not prohibit utility coins and other things because they do want to allow they do want to allow innovation. And I can say this innovation, if you just look at the examples they give, this is a huge potential innovation. Every country around the world needs to allow this to happen. I mean, I fundamentally believe this. I mean, this is a really fundamental innovation. So I think those countries that cannot find a way to strike the balance, I think from an overall competitive standpoint, I think they will be laggards in what is a hugely transformative technology.
Thank you so much. Let's talk about the situation in Korea a little bit, and for the benefit of you and also for the audience, let me try to describe the situation as is often kind of commonly understood. Now, Korea, having achieved so much economic progress over the last 30, 40 years, has, unfortunately, a lot of people feel that we have kind of hit a plateau at about $30,000 per GDP capita. While starting to feel amazing amount of competitive pressure in our traditional industries where we excel, including high-tech manufacturing of, for example, microchip semiconductor manufacturing, shipbuilding, and automotive manufacturing, and so on. At the same time, we find difficulty in growing more creative industries, for example, industries based on software or software-based high-valued services. So in that kind of a context, well, there are certain exceptions like gaming, for example, or some Korean wave content generations and so on, but those are little small scale, in the backdrop of the entire scheme, small scale achievements. So now with blockchain and the knowledge that you have about Korean situation, which areas of industries or processes do you think a country like Korea, having mostly the capability into manufacturing, should focus? And if you actually think that countries like situations in Korea should actually focus its efforts with blockchain, with more policy coordination and more vigor?
So, I mean, I think what's interesting now that sort of wasn't 20 years ago is countries are being very explicit about the technologies that they want to, I mean, countries are now looking at the basket of new and emerging technologies, and they're saying, we in our country want to be very good at those, and we're going to set policy that allows us to do that. There's no better example than China, for instance. The problem is that a lot of these technologies have an interplay with one another. So you can't just sort of be good at AI and be, and you can't be good at self-driving cars, for instance, and not be very good at 5G, because 5G is the way all of these cars talk to each other. So these things now are all completely interrelated, and that's why I think China's been very thoughtful about here's a basket of things that we want to be good at, and they're investing heavily towards that. I think Korea has been a real world leader in telecommunications. I mean, my experience was, the United States had a mere fraction of the broadband that Korea had in going back to around 2005 or so, and obviously, there are some really world-leading companies here and a lot of innovation, but there's going to need to be top-down support for innovation now, because there is in other places in the world. I mean, Donald Trump was talking about the United States getting in and taking over 5G because it's a huge amount of money, because he wants to be competitive. People don't talk like that in the United States typically. It's all been about the market, But these things are now important enough that governments are coming in saying we're gonna make them happen. I actually believe that 5G is dramatically helped by the scenario that I provided there, which is using the blockchain to start infrastructure from the bottom up. So if blockchain is not allowed to flourish here, and I do know there's a lot of interest here, is not allowed to flourish, then the question is, can you also make the infrastructure work too, right? Because oftentimes it isn't one innovation that makes these things take off. It's several innovations happen simultaneously. And that's what happened with the internet. You had, price of PCs coming down, and you had telecommunications equipment that allowed for higher bandwidth, and you can go on and on and on. And it was the collection of those technologies that made the internet just explode. And so I think that whether it's Korea or any other country, if you don't have a top-down and a bottom-up approach to adopting and becoming highly proficient with these technologies, then I think 20 years from now, those countries will pay a significant price.
Thank you. I suppose that we could probably take some comfort in knowing that some of the component technologies and products Korea still excels, for example, memory chips, because memory chips, of course, will be essential for the storage. And of course, also the nationwide approach to install, deploy, and operate massive infrastructures. But of course, you are saying that the nations, including Korea, might have to look at different ways of operating them and even deploying them. Let's talk about jobs a little bit. Now, with everybody's worried about jobs because so many different fundamental changes, technological advancements are kind of taking place all at the same time, creating perfect storms of changes. And people kind of feel like they're at the whim of these large forces of combination that they do not know how to best respond to. Now, and that's where the jobs situation comes in with all these changes. Specifically from blockchain point of view, what are some of the employment opportunities? And how would societies and nations, for example, and companies have to prepare for, in terms of capabilities and readiness, to, if there are possibilities for job creation with blockchain, what would they need to prepare for?
So, I mean, the blockchain is a lot like AI. The biggest problem in doing anything in AI is finding good people who are able to use the technology. It is truly a global competition for talented people from a very, very small pool. If you look at the blockchain today, there are 14 open recs for hiring for every one blockchain engineer. So one thought is become a blockchain engineer or tell somebody you know to become a blockchain engineer because it's a very lucrative skill to have. But it kind of goes back to the same, I'm not a believer that AI or any of these technologies is going to destroy jobs over the next, generation. It might be the generation after that, but there's so much that needs to be built in order for these things to ultimately happen that I don't think it's a short-term thing. It could be, it could be a 100-year thing or a 50-year thing, but I don't see it in the next 20 years. But there are a next generation set of skill sets, and those skill sets need to be within an economy in order to flourish. And again, I think that's where, I think government's taking an enlightened point of view and trying to figure out how do we have these skills is, China's doing the right thing. I mean, they're doing the right thing, which is they're focused on a set of important skill sets, and they're gonna drive competency in these areas. And it was no different than what the United States did, in the post-industrial revolution in the early 20s, when turn of the century, when we built up a huge manufacturing capacity.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit more directly about some of the efforts that you are taking in the media industry. So with your efforts such as VideoCoin and LivePlanet and so on, you obviously have a lot of experience from media, but what are some of the biggest opportunities? You have already touched upon some of those, but what else? And also, could you elaborate a little bit on some of your presented topics? Yeah,
so VideoCoin is part of LivePlanet, and LivePlanet it's created an end-to-end VR system, and VideoCoin is just basically going to be the infrastructure that runs underneath this VR system. In the same way that when Salesforce launched the CRM app, they later turned the Salesforce into a full-on platform for people to build all kinds of apps. What's interesting about video, and I think we're probably one of the first straight video innovation companies. If you think about it, most of the companies that we know today, whether it's Facebook or Google or Amazon, they were all built on text and graphics. And the reason they did that was because doing video even 10 years ago was very, very difficult, from the processing power, the bandwidth, all the things that were needed. So all these companies got really good at doing things like being really good at search, for instance, because, that when you're dealing with text, that's one of the most important things. But now, with 80% of the internet being video and growing at 25% per annum, and even more interesting is that VR takes video from being video and turns it into your reality. So that's a very profound change. So video itself is being transformed, and there's no doubt that 10 years from now, all of us are going to be using VR, and all of us are going to be watching VR video. And so that's itself, because it's a new medium, if you think about the way the internet kind of changed the world as this new medium, I think you're going to have the same kind of thing that happens with VR as well, where people can basically experience, the company's called Live Planet because we want people to be able to project themselves anywhere in the world and to feel like they're there. So you kind of turn on the whole world. It's a pretty profound thought. And so I think that we've kind of hit the end of the media companies using text and graphics, and now we're kind of entering the innovation around video, and that's going to define the winners and losers of the next 20 years.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, that vision certainly is very inspiring, intriguing, very bold, and I can't wait for that feature. But okay, so we are going to the end of the conversation. One last question. I was actually going to ask you about your immediate future plans, but I think we got a lot of your current efforts, so that'll kind of direct. I mean, you've kind of already answered those. So let me just change the question from the script. So, knowing that most of the people in the audience are actually leaders in organizations, I mean, these are the representative leaders from Korea's, mostly Korean organizations. As someone who has, grown companies and led organizations and seen the change is always difficult for anybody, but especially for leaders of the organizations. What would be some of your lessons that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, so when these new technologies come along, you should absolutely hire people, try, and if you fail, you fail. But that's not the point. The problem that happens is when these new technologies come around, I saw this with the internet very clearly. There were some companies that, they couldn't figure out what they wanted to do with the internet, so they did nothing. And the problem they had is when they later figured out what they wanted to do, they had no experience, and the most important thing was no employee wanted to go work for a company that hadn't bothered to hire any internet engineers, right? So when they did go and say, hey, well, look, we want to hire, people are like, well, why is this year 3 in the internet and you still don't have any people? So the battle for all of these new industries is nothing more than a battle for having good engineers and others who are thoughtful. And so you really need to start. And if you get it wrong, you get it wrong. But it's always important to start learning as soon as possible and to demonstrate a track record to your future people you're hiring of having been a leader, an explorer, willing to take risks, and not having to know all the answers before you begin. And I think that's absolutely critical for every company around the world.
Have skin in the game.
Have skin in the game as fast as possible.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.